Tourist crosses the line with the royal guard, instantly regrets it. London's crisp morning air was filled with the excited chatter of tourists gathered outside Buckingham Palace, cameras in hand, ready to capture a piece of British history. The Golden Gate stood tall, shimmering under the sunlight, and in front of them, the royal guards, stoic, unmoving, and disciplined, stood in perfect formation, a symbol of military precision and tradition. Among the visitors was Daniel Foster, a 40-year-old American businessman visiting London with his wife Rebecca and their 15-year-old son Ethan. It was their first time in the UK, and like many tourists, they were eager to explore the famous landmarks. "Man, this place is even bigger in real life," Daniel muttered as he adjusted the settings on his phone, searching for the perfect angle to capture the palace behind him. His wife was flipping through a travel guide, reading out facts about the history of the monarchy, while Ethan remained glued to his phone, barely paying attention. As they wandered through the area, Daniel became increasingly focused on his camera, framing a perfect selfie with the royal guards in the background. Wanting to get a closer shot, he took a few steps forward, not realizing that he had just crossed the invisible line marking the boundary between tourists and the official guard post. "Daniel, don't get too close," Rebecca warned, but her voice barely registered as he adjusted his phone screen, stepping even closer to the uniformed soldiers standing at attention. A few British tourists nearby gasped, their conversations halting as they noticed what had just happened. Some of them exchanged concerned glances, while a couple of visitors pulled out their phones, not to take pictures of the palace, but to record what they knew was about to happen. Daniel, still oblivious, lifted his phone higher, making sure the shot included the guard perfectly in frame. His fingers hovered over the capture button when, thump, a sudden, thunderous stomp broke the air, echoing through the courtyard like a gunshot. The royal guard had moved, and he was not happy. The noise shocked the entire crowd. Even Ethan, who had barely looked up from his phone, was now staring wide-eyed. Daniel's smile faltered, and his body stiffened as he realized something was very, very wrong. Then, in a voice so powerful it cut through the crowd like a blade, the soldier barked his first command: "Stand back." And just like that, everything changed. The thunderous stomp of the royal guard's boot echoed through the courtyard, sending an unmistakable message: a line had been crossed. The sound was so sharp, so forceful, that it caused an instant reaction from the crowd. A woman nearby let out a small gasp. A group of tourists taking photos froze in place, their cameras still raised but no longer clicking. Even Ethan, who had been half distracted moments ago, was now staring wide-eyed at his father. And then, the voice came. "Stand back." It wasn't a request. It wasn't a polite reminder. It was a command, delivered with the force of military discipline honed through years of training. The words boomed across the square, crisp and undeniable. Daniel snapped his head up, the realization hitting him like a slap to the face. The royal guard had spoken to him. Directly. Publicly. For the first time that day, Daniel felt completely exposed. His heart pounded as he registered the situation. He had seen viral videos of the King's Guard reacting to unruly tourists before, but he had never imagined himself being the center of one. Rebecca's voice, now filled with urgency, cut through his daze. "Daniel. Step back. Now." But Daniel hesitated. His brain fought against his instincts. He wasn't trying to be disrespectful. He wasn't one of those tourists who intentionally mocked the guards. He had just stepped too close. Surely, if he just explained. He lifted his hand slightly, palms facing out, in what he thought was a gesture of apology. "Oh, I didn't mean to. Big mistake." The royal guard tightened his grip on his rifle, his eyes locked dead ahead, but his presence spoke volumes. His stance had shifted, no longer just ceremonial, but ready for action. The crowd sensed it. A hush fell over the tourists, as if they, too, understood that Daniel had just made things worse. Rebecca reached for his arm, trying to physically pull him back now. "Daniel, move," she whispered urgently. And then, before he could react, the royal guard moved again. He took a sharp, measured step forward, his polished boots striking the stone with precision. His rifle, once still, now lowered slightly, no longer just an ornamental piece but a tool of authority. The crowd gasped collectively. Ethan's mouth fell open. And Daniel? He finally understood, this was no joke. For a split second, Daniel felt paralyzed. The booming command, the sharp stomp, the sheer authority radiating from the royal guard had struck something deep within him, a primal instinct telling him he had made a mistake. But instead of immediately stepping back, his body betrayed him. His hands were still raised slightly in an apologetic gesture, and his mouth hung open as if his brain was still trying to process what had just happened. His first instinct wasn't to obey, it was to explain himself. "Wait, I wasn't trying to," he started, but the moment the words left his lips, he realized his second mistake. The royal guard did not move. He did not blink. But something about his posture changed, the subtle tightening of his jaw, the way his rifle was held just a fraction firmer, the intensity of his presence. The crowd noticed it too. A murmur ran through the onlookers, whispers of "he needs to back off and this isn't a joke" could be heard. A group of British tourists shook their heads, while an elderly veteran in the crowd watched intently, his lips pressed into a firm line. Rebecca, now fully realizing the weight of the situation, tugged Daniel's arm harder. "Daniel, listen to me. Step back." Even Ethan, who had been disengaged the whole morning, looked up from his phone. "Dad, seriously. Move." But Daniel's ego got in the way. He had never been the kind of man who responded well to being shouted at, much less in public. A part of him, perhaps out of embarrassment, or maybe just sheer stubbornness, wanted to explain himself, to assert that he wasn't trying to cause trouble. So instead of stepping away, he hesitated. The royal guard took another sharp step forward. This time, the impact of his boot hitting the ground was even louder, his stance now unmistakably dominant. The barrel of his rifle, though still pointed downward, was now more controlled, more intentional. The energy of the entire square shifted. The onlookers were no longer just watching a tourist make a mistake, they were witnessing a situation escalate. A security guard at the entrance to the palace noticed the commotion and turned his head, hand instinctively moving to his radio. Rebecca's voice rose in panic. "Daniel, please. Step back before it gets worse." Daniel finally understood. This was not a situation he could talk his way out of. And before he could decide his next move, the royal guard made the decision for him. The entire square fell into an eerie silence. The tension thickened, heavy like a storm about to break. Daniel could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him, tourists who had once been mere onlookers now locked in place, watching every second unfold with breathless anticipation. The royal guard moved again. With absolute precision, he took another sharp, deliberate step forward, his polished black boot striking the stone with a resounding thud. The noise alone sent a visible shockwave through the crowd, causing several people to instinctively recoil. Daniel's breath hitched in his throat. The barrel of the rifle, which had previously been held still and passive, was now angled ever so slightly, a clear and direct warning. This was no longer just about maintaining ceremonial discipline. This was about military enforcement. The royal guard, though still holding his rigid composure, had subtly shifted into combat readiness. For the first time, Daniel felt something colder than embarrassment, he felt fear. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Someone gasped. A woman whispered, "Oh my God, he's serious." A man in the back muttered, "I've never seen them react like that." A group of British veterans watching nearby nodded in silent approval, understanding what had just happened on a level most tourists didn't. Daniel froze, suddenly hyper-aware of the sheer presence of the man before him. The royal guard was not a prop. He was not a performer in a tourist attraction. He was a soldier, one who had been trained to neutralize threats with absolute discipline. And at this moment, Daniel had made himself a threat. His body screamed at him to move, to step back, to obey, but his feet felt glued to the pavement. For the first time in his life, Daniel felt completely and utterly powerless. Rebecca grabbed his arm again. Harder this time. "Daniel. Back up now. Before Daniel could react. New movement. From the edge of the square, two uniformed security officers appeared, moving quickly toward the scene. Their eyes locked onto Daniel with intense focus, one of them already reaching for his radio. This was no longer just a warning. This was about to become an incident. Daniel barely had time to process what was happening before he heard the sharp voice behind him. "Sir, step away from the guard now." His body tensed as he turned slightly, just in time to see two uniformed security officers pushing through the crowd, their expressions serious and unwavering. They weren't running, but their movements were quick and purposeful, a clear sign that this was not just another tourist mishap. Rebecca's grip on his arm tightened to the point of pain. "Daniel, move." At last, the reality of the situation crashed down on him like a tidal wave. This wasn't some funny misunderstanding. This wasn't just an overreaction from a ceremonial soldier. This was real. The Royal Guard hadn't moved an inch since his last command, but his presence alone was suffocating. His rifle, now slightly angled, was still pointed downward, but in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. His duty was to protect, and Daniel had unknowingly crossed a line he never should have. A voice inside his head screamed at him to do what he was told, but his pride still lingered, pushing him toward an unnecessary explanation. "I wasn't trying to." The first officer cut him off immediately. "Sir, you are interfering with active military personnel. Step back, immediately." There was no room for argument in his tone. Daniel felt his stomach drop. His pride shattered. Slowly, finally, he took a deliberate step backward, then another. His face burned hot with embarrassment, but at this point, he didn't care. He just wanted to get away. The officers didn't move until he was fully back behind the designated boundary. One of them kept his gaze locked on Daniel, as if daring him to test them again. The other turned and gave a slight nod to the Royal Guard, a subtle, professional acknowledgement that order had been restored. And just like that, the guard returned to complete stillness. The rifle, the posture, the unwavering stare. It was as if nothing had happened. But everyone in the square knew better. Rebecca exhaled heavily, shaking her head in disbelief. Ethan, who had been quiet the entire time, finally muttered, "Dad? What were you thinking?" Daniel had no answer. Around him, the tension slowly dissolved, replaced by the soft murmurs of tourists recounting what they had just witnessed. Some shook their heads. Others whispered to each other, clearly discussing how close Daniel had come to making an even bigger mistake. One elderly British veteran, standing off to the side, smirked slightly as he leaned toward his friend. "Still think they're just for show?" His friend chuckled. "Not anymore." As the crowd began to disperse, Daniel turned away, face still flushed with humiliation. He had come to Buckingham Palace to see the Royal Guards in action. He never expected to become part of the show.